Number 10, starting off strong with the Boston Strangler. Yeah, you know where this is going. On January 18th, 1967, Albert DeSalvo was convicted and confessed to be the Boston Strangler, though some people believe he wasn't the only one. Due to inconsistencies in the trial, many believe that there was someone else involved. Either way, whoever he was, the Boston Strangler was an awful person. The perpetrator somehow managed to talk his way into women's apartments despite warnings from the media. Women all across Boston were arming themselves, and yet still he found his victims. I don't need to go into detail, but based on his name I think you know how he took their lives. And then some. From June 14th, 1962 to January 4th, 1964, he killed 13 people, abusing the bodies in ways that would haunt your nightmares. So yeah, it's clear why he's on this list. And if that's number 10, get ready. Number 9, Fareed Fatah. This is horrendous. This is absolutely horrendous. Imagine being told that you were sick and dying and then finding out later it was all a lie. Fareed delivered the news to over 500 people, what's supposed to be what every doctor dreads to say, that they were sick and dying. He sent them through various rounds of chemotherapy, radiation, you name it. The thing is, they weren't sick to begin with. Fareed had figured out that he could make millions of dollars off of people participating in these treatments. So while he moved into his million-dollar mansion, his healthy patients suffered horrific side effects from the medications, such as losing their teeth, hair, their strength, etc. If you've ever seen anybody go through cancer treatment, you know it's not amazing at all. His genuinely sick patients died with no care, while his healthy ones got sicker and sicker and eventually just ended up being sick. He would give them hope that they were getting better just to keep them stuffing his pockets. The families also suffered with the impending death of their family members, all for nothing. Finally, the truth came out due to information from a suspicious colleague, and authorities caught up to him. Prosecutors sought an 175-year sentence but settled with 45. Good riddance. And also what really pisses me off about this one is that he got away with it for so long and there was no criticism over like 500 people. That's a lot of people. Ugh, bothers me so much. Let's keep going. Number 8. This one's a little controversial. Oliver Cromwell. Yeah, I know. I don't know. I feel like I'm risky, you know what I mean? He wasn't a very nice guy. Sure, he did some good, but he decimated a lot of people, and he abolished theater, which is a big no in my books. After the Civil War, Cromwell took over as protector of England. For most of his rule, he was pretty much viewed as a dictator. Some believe that he saved democracy, but his means of getting there were brutal and unrelenting. In September 1649, Cromwell's men entered the town of Drogheda and took the lives of everyone they found, which means around 3,500 innocent people died. He acted as God's executioner, his contempt for Catholics feeding the attacks. He was quite brutal to Ireland. Many historians accuse him of ethnic cleansing, especially since a month after Drogheda he did the same thing to Wexford. Eventually he was overthrown by Charles II and his republic failed. And there is some missing nuance, I will admit, so if you want to go ahead and correct me in the comments or go into a debate, go for it. Why not? But there was quite a bit of bad and we can't really ignore that. Not a nice guy. Number 7, Marshall Applewhite. Now we have our first cult leader. Woo! Just kidding, not an appropriate response considering how awful he was. Marshall Applewhite was an infamous leader of the Heaven's Gate cult. His first arrest was a little tame. He was arrested when he failed to return a car that he rented. His reason was that he was divinely authorized to own the car. He had some pretty extravagant disillusions and an inflated perspective of self, as cult leaders often do. He manipulated several people to join his cult and participate in a procedure requiring surgical castration. He made everyone wear baggy clothes and was convinced that they were waiting for a UFO to arrive. The Haley-Bob comet was the signal, and Applewhite organized a Last Supper of sorts. They all went to a restaurant and ordered the same thing: turkey pot pie, cheesecake, blueberries, and iced tea. Not my choice, honestly. Finally, on March 21st, when the comet was days out, he manipulated 30 people to take their own lives. Number 6, The Serpent. I'm a big fan of Jenna Coleman, who played Clara in Doctor Who, and when she showed up in the new Netflix show The Serpent, I was in. But then I was horrified to learn that it was about a real human that existed, and I really wish they didn't. Charles Sobrage, along with his girlfriend Marie-Andre Leclerc, committed a spree of crimes along what was called the Hippie Trail. During the 1970s, Vietnamese Indian Frenchmen lured over a dozen tourists into a false sense of security before taking their lives. He preyed upon travelers in India, Nepal, and Thailand by spiking their drinks, food, stealing their valuables and identities before brutally making them disappear. He became the subject of a massive Interpol manhunt in 1976 after a junior diplomat in Bangkok started to catch on. If his crimes were anywhere as brutal as they were hinted at in the show, I certainly wish he never existed. Thankfully, he continues to serve a life sentence to this day. Number 5. Dennis Rader. I'm surprised that I haven't added him to this list earlier, but I needed to do a part 7, so I guess here we are. The BTK killer, the man not only known for taking the lives of 10 victims, but for how he did it. Between 1974 to 1991, he baffled police with his violent crimes in Wichita, Kansas. BTK was used to describe how he took their lives. I'll have to ask you to look that up because YouTube gets mad at me when I say those words, but I think you can guess that he took his time and he did it viciously. What's even worse is he had everyone fooled into thinking he was a kind, family-loving, God-fearing man. He disappeared after taking his last victim in 1991, but he returned a few years later annoyed that no one had caught him and that the press had died down. In 2004, on the anniversary of one of his crimes, the Otero family, Dennis sent a floppy disk to the police. This helped police track him down to his church, but even then, it wasn't until 2005 that he was finally arrested and sentenced to 10 life sentences. One per victim, I guess. I think we know why he's on this list. Number 4. Ed Kemp. Good old Eddie Kemp. Again, weird that I haven't added him to this list sooner. A weird kind of evil because he actually ended up giving authorities a ton of information on psycho killers. But alas, he haunts my dreams and I just really wish we didn't have to worry about men like him. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I will take ghosts, ghouls, poltergeists, whatever over human beings any day. He had a strange talent for making people believe he was a gentle giant, all while committing 10 of the most gruesome crimes. With an IQ of 145, he easily manipulated his victims into trusting him before it was the last thing they ever did. Standing at 6'9" and weighing 250 pounds, he used both brawn and brains to overpower the women he took. He showed obvious signs of pathological need to kill from a young age, starting with the family cat, all the way to unaliving his paternal grandparents at age 15. You get the gist. Even then, he was able to convince mental health professionals to let him go early. He was charming. He was easy to get along with. He was likable. And he did this. From 1972 to 73, Ed used the line, "Ugh, I don't have all day," to convince hitchhikers to enter his car, implying he was in a rush, put pressure on them, and convinced them that he didn't have time to kill them. They also never caught him. He turned himself in before they could. Number 3, Ted Bundy. Yeah, we're hitting some heavy hitters today. Men like Ted Bundy are the reason women carry keys in between their fingers when they walk at night, or like the reason we cross the street. It's honestly men like some of the ones I mentioned already. Born on November 24th, 1946, who would have known the man he would become? By all accounts, he had a good family, but at an early age, he was already showing dark tendencies. He would spy on unsuspecting women and accumulated an extensive juvenile record, which was wiped clean when he turned 18. He was going to be a lawyer, but soon gruesome deaths spread throughout the nation. He tended to prey on young, attractive college women from Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. He would use his looks and charm to lure them into his clutches or ask them to help him with his books. He would strike them over the head, force them into the vehicle, and drive away to carry out the rest of the deed. He confessed to taking the lives of 36 victims, but alluded that there may have been more, closer to 100. His court case was an absolute media frenzy, because no one could believe such a charming, attractive man, he's not that good looking, could be capable of such horrible things. But suddenly the world was shown. Evil wears a pretty face. Number 2, Andrew Philip Cahoe. Things could have gone either way for Andrew. He loved helping people, but also was quick to anger. Considering he's on this list, we know which direction he went. When he was 14, the stove exploded, setting his mother on fire. Andrew watched her burn a little too long before he grabbed some water and put it out, but by that point it was just too late. Andrew showed the telling signs of darkness through his cruelty towards animals, once beating a horse to death. He married a wealthy woman named Ellen Price in 1911, but despite this, the couple fell into debt. Ellen got TB, pushing them further into debt until finally, at long last, Cahoe snapped. On May 18, 1927, Cahoe took Ellen's life by hitting her in the head. He set the barn on fire with explosives. He had previously placed explosives around the Bath school, and after he burnt down the barn, he drove over and detonated the bombs at the school, killing basically everyone who was inside. Then he filled his truck up with more explosives, admitted the crime in front of everybody and then detonated the truck with a Winchester rifle while he was inside. Number 1, Jean Bedel Bokassa, one of Africa's most brutal dictators, and was even accused of consuming human flesh and even feeding his opponents to animals. He was the self-crowned emperor of the Central African Republic until he was kicked out in 1979. His coronation alone bankrupted his own country, as it basically cost the entire GDP. He took all of the government posts for himself and established what has been referred to as a reign of terror. He personally oversaw brutal beatings and made the rule that thieves should have their ears cut off. He arrested school patrons for not wearing uniforms made in the factory he owned and even had 100 of them executed. In 1980, he was finally sentenced to death in absentia, though he decided to return to Africa in 1986. Why he was allowed to, no idea. From there, he was tried again for his crimes, but he never faced the death penalty. Instead, he just went to jail and he was released in 1993, then he died, and then he was pardoned in 2010. What? Why was he pardoned? He was literally the worst. Number 10, Ferdinand I, King of Naples. Ferdinand, what a name. You had so much promise, but then you had to go ahead and take the phrase, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer, way too literally. Everyone was so excited when Ferdinand first became King of Naples. He was smart, courageous, confident. He had all the promise of being a wonderful king, but then the power must have gotten to his head or something, or he was really insecure, because soon his intent turned cruel and malicious, especially if you were on his bad side. Ferdinand liked to have dinner parties with his enemies and loved them so much he wanted them to stay forever. He would imprison them, even throw them out of windows before retrieving their corpse and staging them in what he called the Black Museum. I know, Black Mirror, right? He had them embalmed and then dressed in the clothing they wore while alive and placed at the dinner table like they were enjoying a banquet. To all those on his good side, his so-called Black Museum became a grim warning should he ever be crossed. If he suspected any of his subjects were going to betray him, he would even invite them to visit the museum so they could see where they might end up. Charming. Number 9, Hernan Cortez. There are several reasons as to why this man was the absolute worst of the time. The Spanish conquistador left blood wherever he went. 1. He decimated the Aztec Empire with his forces and slaughtered thousands of defenseless people. 2. He was rumored to have taken the life of his wife and enslaved over 20 Mesoamerican women to be his concubines against their will. Yay. 3. He also exploited Aztec and indigenous political systems for his own gain, even imprisoning a king in his own home. Number 4. He, along with his fellow explorers, gave them blankets, infecting the population with smallpox. Whether they knew this would happen remains up for debate. The history of colonialism is bloody and cruel in a lot of ways, with Hernan Cortez being one of the cruelest. It's strange to think that much of what we know today wouldn't exist without conquistadors like Cortez, but I always wish that things never went the way they did. But as many people on this list prove, we are not short on cruelty in the history of the world. Number 8, Emperor Zheng Da. So almost immediately, people didn't love this guy when he rose to power. Imagine being in a monarchy, it's just like a roll of the die. Is he gonna be crazy or is he gonna be sane? We just don't know. Firstly, there was a rumor that he wasn't a legitimate heir and that he was born by one of the queen's handmaidens, not the actual queen. But he took full advantage of his role and became one of the most notorious leaders during the Ming Dynasty. His court lived in constant fear, as many of his upright officials were purged and taken out. He didn't have much interest in courtly affairs and wanted instead to become a military general. He had a crowd of eunuchs that followed him everywhere, to whom he entrusted many government matters. They were very corrupt. He also liked to give orders to his imaginary double named General Zhu Shao. He left his court to be entirely run by his eunuchs, who allowed corruption and terror to breed, while he retired to pleasures in his own castle. He was also known for demanding cruel punishment, such as that which he did to one of his eunuchs, who wronged him. Number 7, King John. I'm actually reading a book about him and his brother right now, which is really interesting. King John wanted so badly to be remembered, but he just reeked so bad of desperation that he stunk up all of history. King John was so awful, he became immortalized as the main villain in the tale of Robin Hood. For a long time, John lived in the shadow of his terrifying and mighty older brother, Richard the Lionheart. But then Richard had to go off to reclaim the Holy Land, leaving the throne empty. Kind of. Despite attempts to prevent John from weaseling his way onto the throne in Richard's absence, John did so anyway, and no one could stop his cruelty. Richard died in 1199 from gangrene, and John began his reign. Let's see, where do we begin? Well, he took the life of his own nephew. He starved whoever he considered an enemy, including the wife of one of his best friends. He repeatedly retreated in battle because he was such a coward. He extorted and exploited his own country by enforcing ridiculous taxes and much more. He had to be forced to sign the Magna Carta, a charter of rights that remains one of the most pivotal documents in history. So needless to say, where his brother Richard established a legacy of heroism and valor, John did the exact opposite. Number 6, Attila the Hun. Attila? More like, I'll kill ya the Hun. He left a bloody and horrific legacy throughout his reign and conquest across Europe in the 5th century. Born in 406 AD, Attila was sent to the Roman court at the age of 12 as a hostage. Sometime between then and adulthood, Attila grew into a ruthless king who took the life of his own brother before embarking on his violent conquest. He pillaged over 100 cities and even arrived at the gates of Rome. It was his reign that plunged much of Europe into the Dark Ages. Like, he is responsible for that. The attacks his armies made were so horrifying that the name Attila became synonymous with chaos, destruction, and death. To the Romans, the Huns were barbarians led by the Scourge of God, yet another name for Attila. His rampage was so fast and vast that the empire just couldn't sustain itself. Eventually his rule ended, but there was a weird moment where a Roman princess named Honoraria sent him a ring and asked for him to help her escape. So there was like a weird romance happening. She was engaged to someone she didn't want to be married to, and she thought Attila was a better choice. I don't know. Attila claimed her as his betrothed, though he had like 20 wives already. God, leave some for the rest of them, you know? Though he was inevitably denied, he went on another bloody crusade because he was so heartbroken, but looks like he didn't really need that much encouraging. Number 5, Oskar Dirlewanger. The 36th Grenadier Division under the SS in World War II Germany was an experimental division that used hardened criminals as enforcers, and they were led by one horrendous man, Oskar Dirlewanger. He was a veteran from World War I and started out as a volunteer for the SS until he began to abuse his superiors. A 1942 Reich police said, and I quote, that he was a mentally unstable, violent fanatic and alcoholic who had the habit of erupting into violence under the influence of drugs. That was somebody from World War II Germany saying that about him. You know what I mean? They were so evil and they said that about him. Right? He was thrown in prison, and that should have been the last anyone heard of him. But then, SS official Gottlob Berger got a hold of him. They served together in World War I and they were buddies, and Berger pulled him from prison and sent him to fight. This led to his position as the leader of the Grenadier Division, aka the Dirlewanger Unit. His unit was made up of some of the worst criminals imaginable, and as a result, they were responsible for the torment of civilians without discrimination. All the most horrific things you can think of. Eventually though, Dirlewanger was captured by the French and handed off to the Polish to be finished off. They tormented him for days until he finally died on June 5th in 1945 from the injuries he sustained while being interrogated. So it feels like a fitting end in a weird way. So kind of satisfying, but because he was awful, truly. I left out a lot of the stuff, but just Google it. You'll see. Number 4, Michael Swango. This one, the case of Michael Swango is not only horrifying because of what he did, but also because of how long it took for him to get caught and for it to stop. It's insane. A serial poisoner, Michael Swango, swindled and lied his way into the medical field, leaving a trail of bodies behind him. First of all, this man kept a scrapbook of car crashes and horrific accidents, and even admired the poisoning techniques used in concentration camps in World War II. Red flags went off all over the place during his training in medical school, with patients mysteriously dying every time they touched him. He was nicknamed 007 with the catchphrase "License to Kill," but nobody did anything. In one case, one of the survivors directly implicated him when she said he injected her with something right before she underwent violent seizures. But he was exonerated because the hospital didn't want the press. Ugh! Then he was hired again and again at several places and poisoned staff on 2 separate occasions with first fried chicken and then donuts. He was caught, finally, sentenced to 5 years, released after 2 for unknown reasons, and then started working under aliases. He traveled to you can tell this makes me really mad. You can tell this makes me really mad because nobody did background checks. He traveled to Africa, and after a trail of bodies started turning up there, police found massive stores of poison in his home. Oh yeah, and before he left for Africa, he stole all of his girlfriend's money and she took her own life because of it. He was finally caught in 1997 and is serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Number 3, Hermann Göring. I don't know why he hasn't been on part 2 or 3, but he's here now. He was one of evil Charlie Chaplin's main henchmen, one of the leaders of the National Socialist Party. His role in organizing the police state in Germany and establishing concentration camps for corrective treatments is primarily what he's remembered for. And what a legacy. He was beside the German dictator since the very beginning and even participated in the party's first attempt to take over the German government in the failed Beer Hall Putsch. It was during that event that Göring was severely injured and developed an addiction to morphine for the rest of his life. Fun fact. But honestly, I don't care. He was awful. No pity for the guy, because you know what's also a fun fact? He organized the Night of the Long Knives, where he, along with the SS, assassinated 85 members of the political opposition. Yeah, he was so loved by the Führer that he was even declared his successor until he tried to take the position early in 1939 and was placed under house arrest by the Führer. Göring stood trial and was condemned to death after the war, though he took his own life via cyanide the night before his execution. So we never really got the full justice, but we almost got there. Okay, number 2. I've done 6 of these lists, and you'd think I'd become numb to it, kind of at this point, but when I read about this man, I felt like I'd be kicked in the stomach, so fair warning. It seems as though the evil experiments in German World War II camps never ends. Karl Kahlberg was a gynecologist who, prior to the war, was actually trying to help infertile women conceive. You may want to stop here if this is a sensitive subject for you. As you can guess, he did the opposite as soon as he landed in the concentration camps. He joined the National Socialist Party in 1938. He soon approached another evil man, Heinrich Himmler, who we've talked about in previous videos, and requested permission to experiment on sterilization procedures. He wanted to see if there was a way to perform sterilization on a large group of people in a short amount of time. He injected thousands of women with toxins without anesthesia, which resulted in extreme pain and most often death. Sometimes he would even take their lives just so he would have a cadaver to research. His place of work was Auschwitz, and then after the Soviets moved in, he moved to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Finally, he was caught by the Soviets and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was soon released to stand trial in Germany, but he died before he could be sentenced in 1957. Number 1, Lenin. The worse, the better. Vladimir Lenin is one of the most controversial people on this list. A kind of inspirational tyrant, Vladimir Lenin founded the Russian Communist Party, led the Bolshevik Revolution, and was the mind behind the Soviet state. He has in fact been regarded as one of the greatest revolutionary leaders in history, so like why the heck is he on this list? Lenin's Soviet Union led the way for people such as Joseph Stalin to oppress and brutalize their own people by establishing a society that suffocated freedom. One of the most horrific events he was responsible for was the Red Terror. The Red Terror was a state-sponsored wave of cutthroat brutality that spanned from September 1918 until 1922. In an attempt to maintain control, Lenin's Bolsheviks used terror to silence any opposition. Thousands, even millions potentially, were forced into concentration camps, which ended in their execution. Lenin's foundation of state-sanctioned violence would lead to millions of deaths throughout his leadership, and of course, his predecessors, especially Joseph Stalin. So that's why he's number 1. Number 10, Tamerlane the Great. How about Tamerlane the not great dude? Oh, it's so bad. Tamerlane was a great conqueror of the Turks who was infamous for building a tower of skulls. This man will make you thankful for democracy, or just like everything we have today, if you weren't already. He ruled around 40 years until he died in 1405 CE. He was a huge fan of Genghis Khan and he believed he was his descendant. He wasn't directly on his father's side, but he kind of was. And based on what we know of Genghis Khan, not hard to believe he had a lot of kids. To pay homage to his great-grandfather, he built an empire that stretched across Russia, the Mediterranean, and India. No mercy was his motto, annihilating whole cities in one fell sweep. He burned down a mosque in Damascus with people still inside just to heighten the fear. One of the most gruesome things he ever did was behead over 90,000 people, enough to build 100 towers of decaying skulls. right? Unlike his idol Genghis Khan, his brutal campaign wasn't about protecting trade routes and flanks, but more about, bragging rights and power. The Timurid Empire didn't survive for very long because they never put in any governmental structures after they destroyed their territory, so it's kind of like once you just conquer somewhere, you have to take care of it after, but he didn't. In other words, he may have conquered many places, but he never truly ruled after he destroyed them. He killed around 19 million people, probably more, during his conquest and skinned alive any who wouldn't convert to Islam. Whew! Vicious! Vicious! Number 9, Issei Sagawa. Man, I can't believe this dude is just like walking around free. It really freaks me out. I don't want to forget this man exists at all, so if I ever see him, I can run in the opposite direction, and as should you. In 1981, Sagawa took the life of Renee Hartevelt and then he ate her. Yeah. He took 2 days to consume her, and apparently this crime had fulfilled a lifelong desire for Sagawa. He did try to get diagnosed by a psychiatrist who actually declared him highly dangerous, but because he was the son of a rich Japanese businessman, rather than getting help, his father sent him to school in Sorbonne, France. Issei apparently had the desire when he saw his classmates' thighs while at school, and he thought they looked delicious. Ugh. While at school in France, he finally met his target, Renee. The two became friends. Well, on her end. She had no idea what was about to happen. Thankfully, she wouldn't have realized what was about to happen as he shot her in the back, which is like a really small mercy. Ugh, I'm glad she wasn't like cognizant. He selected her because of her youth and beauty, and Issei wanted to absorb her energy so he wouldn't be as weak. He packed up what was left of her corpse into a suitcase and took a cab over to a park and dropped them off. But bystanders saw the blood leaking and called the police. He admitted it, was declared insane, as he already was, deported back to Japan where he was supposed to stay in a mental institution, but they declared him sane, and since the case was dropped in France, he only had to stay for 15 months in the institution. And he is now free, walks the streets, and says he still has the same desires. Number 8. The Killer Actor. A black mark on the profession, no doubt. Ramiro Artaida was so set on revenge and coercion that he went to acting school so he could be better at it, right? Between 1937 and 1939, Ramiro was responsible for the gruesome deaths of over 8 women. His thing was that he would create characters in order to lure women to secluded areas. His go-tos were a monk, a film producer, and a professor. The motivation behind his killing spree was related to the accusation made against him years before. Ramiro was engaged to be married, and he came from a wealthy estate. He was accused of killing his older brother in order to ensure that the estate passed solely to him, and it was due to these accusations that his fiancée left him, but nothing was proven. Distraught, he fled Bolivia and studied drama in the US, only to return and exact revenge on any women who looked like his ex. Like, talk about a dramatic breakup. Thankfully, he was caught and sentenced to death in 1939. Yikes. Number 7. The Great Blood Sorceress. What a name, right? Next up, we have Magdalena Solis, who unfortunately earned the bad nickname of the Great Blood Sorceress. Why was this woman so evil? Well, she was a cult leader who manipulated and tormented her followers due to her warped sense of self. A religious fanatic with an already delusional sense of who she was, she joined the Santos Cayetano Hernandez cult in 1963 in Mexico. She traveled with the cult to Yerba Buena, a town with a tiny population of only 50 people, all sadly destitute and poor. She took severe advantage of the people, convincing them that she was the reincarnation of an Aztec goddess. Okay? I don't know if you know anything about the Aztec tradition, but whoa. The brothers who founded the group knew it was fake, but Magdalena even sold herself on the charade. She was responsible for 8 confirmed deaths, though probably more. They died due to the gruesome ritual sacrifices she performed on them. Like, think Temple of Doom, Indiana Jones, like that. That's exactly what she did. Ugh! This woman would torment and beat them, then take out their hearts and drink their blood. Like, ugh! Just horrendous. I hate this. It's just gross. Don't join cults. Anyways. Number 6. Delphine Lalaurie. It was only a matter of time before Delphine Lalaurie made it onto this list, and I know you've been waiting. Lalaurie first caught suspicion over her cruelty when a servant girl threw herself off of a balcony whilst being chased by Lalaurie. But the real horrors were revealed when rescuers found a 70-year-old slave slave woman chained to the stove during a house fire. The woman had set the fire herself and tried to take her own life for fear her punishment would lead her to the attic. When authorities ventured up to the attic themselves, they saw several bodies of servants mutilated and hung by the neck. Needless to say, the whole town was set ablaze after that with anger. A mob surrounded the Lalaurie mansion with the desire of confronting and punishing the cruel woman, but she had disappeared. To this day, no one knows what happened to her. I mean, she's definitely dead. She was socially ruined, but as to where and how, no one knows. But she was never properly punished for her crimes. Number 5. Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm actually surprised Dahmer hasn't made it onto this list until now, but here he is. What creeps me out the most about Dahmer is his awareness that what he was doing was wrong. He just couldn't help himself. With a genius level IQ of 145, Dahmer was a ticking time bomb. His desire to mutilate started out the way you expect with animals as a young child, but prior to his rise to crime, he fell to alcohol abuse and dropped out of business school before enlisting in the US Army. According to Dahmer, he knew what he wanted to do, but he just hadn't found the opportunity. But he was discharged after attacking 2 fellow soldiers, and it was after this that he began pursuing the title of the Milwaukee Cannibal, which is what he became later. Between 1971 and 1991, he killed 17 men in a variety of gruesome ways and celebrated each and every one. One of the things he did that I wish I didn't know was he attempted to make a human zombie by drilling into his victims' heads. One of his victims escaped and notified police. When they got there, the chief medical examiner remarked it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Dahmer was killed behind bars by another inmate in 1994. Number 4. The Monster of Ecatepec. Truly a monster. There are monsters in this world, as this series of lists have proven. Juan and Patricia Carlos were responsible for taking the lives of over 20 women, causing widespread panic in Mexico City in 2018. Patricia was his helper and would lure women to their home by promising them cheap clothes. Once inside, Juan would take over and severely violate them in perverse ways before taking their lives. The couple would also remove organs and feed them to their dogs. They were not picky with their victims either, making it hard for authorities to develop a pattern. They took any woman they found, even a young mother, and they tried to sell her infant she left behind. But unfortunately though, quite gruesomely, the 2 were caught when they were found pushing a stroller of body parts. Carlos warned police after his arrest that should he be released, he will do it all again, so they better listen to him. Just keep him there. Coming up to number 3, if you like this list so far, make sure to show some love, like, subscribe, comment, do your thing. It's gonna get weirder from here, so if this is too much for you, please take a moment, go for a walk, do what you need to do, and then come on back. Number 3, Andre Chikatilo. I think the creepiest and most evil people are the ones you least expect, and that's what terrifies me about this guy. I would take a poltergeist any day over someone like Andre. Andre was a teacher in the Soviet Union, trusted by so many, but little did anyone know he took the lives of 50 young people before he was caught. His case actually inspired the book Child 44 by Tom Robb-Smith, which is actually one of my favorites, by the way, couldn't put it down. The reason he was able to get away with the killings for so long was because of the USSR. Crimes like this didn't exist in Stalin's Russia, so these events were often covered up at the scene, so it was easy for criminals like this to get away. Meanwhile, Andre was addicted to taking the lives of these women, as it was the only way he could achieve satisfaction. The reason he was so pathologically messed up started in his early childhood. Stalin's agricultural policies caused widespread famine, and from part 1 we know he's not a good guy himself. But Andre was believed to have suffered from water on the brain at birth, causing him to get frequent UTIs and often wet his bed. He was also bullied due to his father's capture in World War II because it was seen as cowardly. Whatever the cause may be, he still committed some vicious crimes, and thankfully he was arrested in the 1990s. And though we have sympathy for him, man, takes a certain kind of person to do something so horrible. And number 2, Shiro Ishii. We've talked about Mengele in a previous video, but it's time we talked about Ishii. Ishii and Mengele honestly probably would have been best friends, both having a sick fascination with cruelty and medicine. Shiro Ishii was the director of Unit 731 in the Department of Biological Weapons for the Japanese Army in World War II. What was his job? To develop an understanding of the most deadly kinds of science. How? Well, I bet you can guess. He would perform all of his experiments on prisoners of war trying to understand disease, warfare, and sickness. He would perform horrendous experiments such as injecting prisoners prisoners with diseases like anthrax and testing out biological weapons on them. His unit even performed live vivisections on prisoners, inflicting them with hypothermia, frostbite, induced strokes, and heart attacks. His cruelty resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. The war was awful, but because of him, soldiers would have rather been shot than sent to a Japanese POW camp. But the worst part is, the US pardoned him in exchange for the results of his experiments. That is absolutely shameful to me. I hate that. Number 1. Norway Terror. July 2011 was a horrific day for the people of Norway after 77 people were killed by right-wing extremist Anders Breivik. At 3:26 p.m. on July 22nd, a fertilizer bomb went off outside the building of the Prime Minister. 8 people were killed. After that, Anders ventured to Utoya Island wearing a police uniform. Young adults were at a Labour Party youth camp on which Anders opened fire, taking out anyone who tried to escape. Finally, at 6:27, he was taken into custody by the Norwegian police unit. Beyond the 69 young adults whose lives were taken, 319 people were injured, and a later study showed that 1 in 4 people in Norway knew someone who had been there. This was the worst crime ever committed in Norway, and with 1 in 4 Norwegians having known someone, it hit very close to home to many of them. But the worst part about Anders is that though he admitted to the crime, he denied responsibility because the crimes were necessary. The saddest part about making these lists is that there really is no shortage of awful people in the world. The best we can do is try to be one of the good ones.